Hello and welcome to Western Wisconsin Journal. I'll be your guest host today, Sarah Malick-Wahls, and I'm affiliated with the Hudson RiverFest, and that's where I'm excited and connected to this topic of natural resources to speak with you all today and to learn from our guest. So today we have with us Dr. Josh Kapfer. He is a professor at the Department of Biological Sciences at University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. He's a certified wildlife biologist and co-editor and author of a 2022 book titled Amphibians and Reptiles of Wisconsin. Josh edited this book along with Donald Brown, and there are a long list of experts in the field that contributed to this book. So our topic today that we want to talk about is amphibians and reptiles. We'll learn a little bit about them in Wisconsin, and a little bit about the book itself as well. So first off, Josh, can you tell us, why should we care about amphibians and reptiles?
Yeah, so as a wildlife biologist, a conservation biologist, it's sort of strange to me to apply value to things, because they sort of have value in their existence, right? And so, but I get asked this question a lot because people tend to think of amphibians and reptiles as slimy, small, inconspicuous, unimportant, scary. And so generally speaking, the first thing I think of when I think of the quote unquote value of amphibians and reptiles is they are, in fact, an incredible ambassador to between people and wildlife. Right. And it might not seem like that because, again, they're scary to some, they're slimy, et cetera. But that's all a learned behavior that you pick up from other people when you're young. The reality is, when I take kids out for my college classes, or if I'm out with younger kids, I can have them hold a frog. I can have them hold a snake. I can't have them hold a coyote. I can't have them hold a bald eagle. So there is the ability to make direct connections between humans and wildlife through amphibians and reptiles, more so than any group of vertebrates, except maybe fish, right? You can catch fish and hold them as well. So that, in my opinion, is one of their biggest values. But again, I'm an educator, so that's important to me. Now, if we wanted to come up with a more direct, quote unquote, benefit or value for people who, don't intend to pick them up or aren't interested in the connection to wildlife, amphibians and amphibian larvae consume millions of insect larvae that we might consider pests throughout their life cycle. Snakes, for example, many species of snakes eat large numbers of rodents, right? And rodents are one of the vectors for Lyme disease, which is spread by a tick, and it requires rodents like white-footed mice and also white-tailed deer in large abundances to complete its life cycle. And amphibians and reptiles reduce one of those hosts. And rodents can be pests in agricultural settings. And so, there are many benefits like that that amphibians and reptiles have.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that kind of doorway into experiencing and having a connection with other types of vertebrates as well. One of the questions that I had was, how can families and the general public experience amphibians and reptiles? Like, where should they look for them? How do they find them? Are they all under rocks, or do you have to get your feet wet wading in a lake? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, because they're small frequently and inconspicuous, and they do like cover, oftentimes it does require going out and looking in specific locations, under rocks, under logs, etc. However, turtles, for example, if you are near a water body, you may not be able to catch the turtle and hold on to it, but if you scan logs and things with the binoculars, basking sites for turtles, you can very frequently see turtles, especially if you're in backwater areas of the big rivers. There's lots of really cool river turtle species that we find in those bigger rivers. So that's one way to see them. Spending time outdoors in nature, eventually you're going to run into an amphibian and or reptile. Sometimes they're just out basking. I spent a lot of time especially when I was in my 20s, going out specifically trying to find things I had never seen, because there was a number of species in the state I had never seen at that point. And I'd spend all of these hours traipsing around and up and down bluffs and etc. And then somebody would tell me, oh yeah, I saw one of those things in my backyard the other day. Right. So sometimes it's just luck. You happen to be in the right place at the right time. Time of year makes a big difference. They tend to be more active earlier in the summer and later spring when they're sort of above ground, basking now, getting away from being underground for winter. So there is a lot of, and then it has to do with how common they are. So species that are particularly common, the American toad, for example, pretty easy to find just being out in nature in natural areas. Whereas there are much rarer species like the Blanchard's cricket frog, that it would be very hard to just walk around and randomly come across one.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, so related to that, how rare species are and whatnot, I'm thinking about like biological hotspots. And when we look at Wisconsin, are there certain like regions of the states that tend to have a higher number of species or greater abundance in general?
So it depends on the species group. Now here in Wisconsin, we actually have a relatively low species richness, or a low number of amphibian and reptile species compared to Florida or Louisiana, or more warm, wet places. However, we have a really interesting mix of amphibians and reptiles because of where we exist geographically. We're on the edge of many of their ranges. They have to sort of deal with these unique conditions, or not unique conditions, but harsh conditions in the winter. So that results in maybe not tons of species living here, but them having really interesting behaviors and adaptations to their environment. And so where we tend to find certain species will depend in large part about their environmental needs. So for example, the large constrictor snake species, those are more frequently focused. There are more species of those, I should say, along the Mississippi and Wisconsin River valleys, because they need that bluff habitat. They need rock crevices and fissures that get below the frost line, because they're so large. They can't just rely on random mammal burrows and et cetera that might be on the landscape. They need to have these reliable sources like big rock crevices along these bluff outcroppings that get below the frost line. So we tend to see more of the species like bull snakes, rat snakes, timber rattlesnakes, for example, the bigger constrictors in those regions of the state. Whereas we don't get those here where I am in southeastern Wisconsin, because we don't have bluffs. We don't have places where they can overwinter. So it kind of depends on the species group. Obviously, you get along the rivers, then you also start to see more and more of the different turtle species. So we have 3 map turtle species that are really only found in bigger rivers. You don't find them in ponds or lakes so much. We have a soft shell turtle species, the smooth soft shell, that's primarily a bigger river species. So we see sort of separation of where these species exist based on their habitat and environmental needs.
Yeah, that makes sense. Some part about your book that I really like. Well, first, let's just talk about the book broadly. So it's a big, hefty book. So I could imagine some folks might seem a little intimidated about the size of the book if they're new to amphibians and reptiles. But it seemed like the way that it was written was, there's a lot of technical material, but there's also, it seemed pretty approachable in that there's like summaries in the beginning. And the part that I really liked about the book was these little boxes that were like natural history notes about it. And there were also, that was the biggest part that I've been kind of paging through the book and keen in on those, because I'm finding a lot of personal stories in there and really enjoying that part. And so I kind of wanted to ask some of the, I don't know if you'll remember every natural history note in there, but I had a few things that I thought would be fun to hear you elaborate on from that part of the book. And so the first thing was this idea of wood turtle worm thumping. And I was wondering if you could elaborate and tell our audience what that is. And then also, is this unique to wood turtles, or is this like a common feeding strategy for turtles?
Sure. I'm really glad that you mentioned the approachability of the book, because one of our goals was we knew the book was going to be written in part for professionals that work in ecology conservation, people that had a scientific interest in these organisms, but we also wanted it to be something that was valuable or useful to people that didn't have a scientific background. And so that's specifically why we included those at a glance sections at the beginning of each chapter, that summary, that summarizes most of the big relevant information about each species. So you don't have to read through all that technical stuff. And these natural history boxes were another sort of thing we wanted to include to make sure that the just people that were just passingly interested could find things to look at and read and find interesting. And then if they wanted to, they could delve into, you know, the accounts more deeply. And we even tried to write those in a way that were relatively straightforward English and not too much technical jargon. Sometimes it couldn't be avoided, of course, but the worm thumping specifically, I have never witnessed that myself, right? And I would love to. It's incredible, right? Wood turtles are such a cool little turtle species, and so this habit, which that natural history box was written by James Harding at Michigan State University, and he had observed them in the field, sort of stomping their feet on the ground, and surmised that then this resulted in vibrations that brought worms to the surface, and then the turtles would eat those worms. So what that in and of itself is fascinating, right? And there are no other turtles in Wisconsin that do this. There are no other turtles in the Midwest that do this that I'm aware of. Now, there's another species globally that does something like this that I'm not aware of. It's entirely possible, but there's no other ones in the upper Midwest that do this type of behavior that anybody's documented. But what interests me about that in particular, it's interesting in and of itself, but most of the earthworms we have here currently are introduced, right? Most of them are from European stock, or, you know, were introduced through soil and agriculture and ornamental plants. So what were these turtles eating before, when we had no exotic worms? So was there a native earthworm that got out competed by these exotic earthworms? Was there something similar to an earthworm that no longer exists that we never documented before they went extinct? So we have a number of these worm specialists in the state, and things that use worms as part of their diet. And I just often wonder, what were they eating before there were these exotic earthworms around? So I guess that's a very convoluted answer to your question. I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I mean, and it also makes you wonder, are wood turtles, like, what's their intelligence level? And maybe they adapted as a new food source became available, they developed this behavior or something.
Yeah.
Another natural history note that I thought was fun to read. Somebody was talking, one of the authors had a story of seeing grackles. So common grackles, a type of black bird that a lot of people might have seen around Wisconsin, cleaning leeches off of map turtles when they were like, I think they were like basking on logs or something. And so I was wondering if you wanted to talk about, like, why you think they might have been doing that. And also it made me wonder about, I just had never pictured leeches on turtles, even though they live in these places that, you know, there's plenty of leeches around. So it made me think about just parasites on turtles in general. And I thought, so this is kind of a two-part question, but was also just kind of wondering what kind of parasites are problems for turtles, and are they mainly ones that they've evolved with, or are there like new emerging parasites we should be concerned about?
So that natural history box was written by Richard Carl Vogt before he passed away, and he actually wrote right before our book, not right before, but in 81, he published a book on the amphibians and reptiles of Wisconsin. And it's a much beloved book among natural history buffs and amphibian and reptile enthusiasts in the upper Midwest. And he included a lot of anecdotal stories in his book. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to include these natural history boxes as well, was to emulate Vogt's book a little bit, because that part of his book was so well beloved. And so he actually wrote that account, and he passed away in January of 21, I believe. So he never got to see the final product of the book, unfortunately. But he observed these grackles, as you had mentioned, picking leeches off of turtles that were basking on logs. And he looked at that as a mutualistic relationship. In other words, the turtles are having parasites picked off of their body in the form of these leeches, and the grackles were benefiting. So the turtles were benefiting, the grackles then were benefiting because they were getting a meal out of it. And so, so yeah, it was really cool that he included that little bit of information, because he had not reported that elsewhere in all of his works that I've ever seen. So it was really nice that he included that information in the book. And so as far as parasites, so all of these organisms have, amphibians and reptiles have numerous parasites that they carry, parasites in their intestines and parasites in their lungs, and sometimes in their blood and tissues. These leeches are external, and so many of those parasites, they probably have some sort of a toll on the organism, but they have co-evolved over time to be able to deal with that to a degree. So when I was an undergraduate and during my PhD, I worked with parasitologists. They were my major research advisors. And so even though I didn't really do parasitology research, except when I was an undergraduate, the two individuals that had a lot of influence over me as a developing student were parasitologists. And so it's astounding the number of parasites these organisms carry. Like, we would dissect frogs when I was an undergraduate for part of our research that I did with my faculty advisor, whose name was Dr. Dan Sutherland. We would dissect these frogs, and their lungs would be so full of flukes. It was amazing that they worked at all, like that you could absorb any oxygen. Now, of course, frogs can also absorb oxygen through their skin, so there are other avenues of oxygen uptake, but they were able to survive and act like completely normal frogs. My doctorate advisor, Dr. James Coggins, was also a parasitologist, and he was very interested in intestinal flukes. Now, there are diseases, emerging infectious diseases that affect amphibians and reptiles. And those are ones, when it's an emerging infectious disease, we would consider it something that's relatively new, and there hasn't been that sort of time together where the parasite and the host have sort of developed over time, not a relationship, but kind of a relationship where, if the parasite completely wipes out all of its hosts, it has nowhere to live. Right. So there has to be this sort of ebb and flow a little bit. But with these emerging infectious diseases, we're theoretically at the front end of that. And so chytrid fungus is one right now that has a huge impact on frogs, amphibians. And globally, that one has caused extinctions. That they believe maybe that is related to changes in climate, making fungi that were previously perhaps not so much of a pathogen, but because they're facultative or they take advantage of the right opportunity, changes in climate have led to them becoming more of a pathogen for frogs. There's something called snake fungal disease that affects snakes. And again, it might, could be that that's just a fungus that exists everywhere in the landscape, but because of changes in climate, that has become more of a pathogen and has become more problematic for some species of snakes. So there are many parasites that these organisms carry all the time that don't really negatively impact their survival to the point that, it has negative population impacts. But then there are parasites that do, cause problems for some of these organisms.
Yeah, it's amazing, with the current medical technology. I mean, humans, we're having any kind of parasite nowadays just seems like, oh no, that's the end of the world.
Yeah.
Because we're so used to being free from those. But of course, humans for much of our history also carried a lot more parasites.
Absolutely. And I mean, well, and we just went, we're still going through a huge issue with an emerging infectious disease, which is COVID, right? So, you know, we were at that was an example of what happens when you have, you know, an infectious disease introduced to a host that's novel and you know, caused lots of problems. So there are things that we have evolved with. I mean, you could argue that the flu virus is something maybe that we've evolved with over time, and you know, but then you can also get these emerging or novel diseases that cause much bigger impacts.
Yeah. So you touched on some conservation issues, and I want to come back to that. But one other topic in the natural history boxes was, and I don't remember the details very well, but it had to do with giant toads developing on an island. And I was wondering if you could kind of recap that for us, or summarize that, and then also talk about like just separation of populations. Is this common to see really large toads over, you know, in one area and then they're much smaller over there, or is that kind of variation, you know, pretty unusual?
Yeah, so that was a natural history box written by Andrew Badgie from the Wisconsin DNR, and he had coordinated with and used data collected by a fellow named Charles Long, who was at UW Stevens Point. And Charles had collected this information on these toads on one of the islands in the Great Lakes, where there were these huge toads that he had collected, and they were larger on average than toads he was finding on the mainland. And so I have never experienced that with toads myself, and I know that there are toads that are very large on the mainland as well. And so you know, it was a really, really interesting observation that Dr. Long had uncovered there. And so it's just something that what we would need to do is collect more data, right? More data on toads on mainland versus toads on islands, and et cetera. But it would be a really interesting study to keep going, right? Something to keep investigating. And it was really cool that he made that observation and reported it and let Andrew use those data on that. And so as far as whether that's common among toads, I'm not really certain about. I don't think it's a quote unquote common phenomenon in general, I should say, in general, across toads to see that type of, well, here's an isolated population that now is much larger than the rest of the toads. Toads are so ubiquitous though, and they're so common that it's pretty hard for individuals to become isolated in a location. Islands off of the Great Lakes might be one of the only situations in Wisconsin where we can imagine that, just because toads are found everywhere else. Now, surely we see genetic differentiation in rarer species where, you know, like we think of very rare species like ornate box turtles, for example, which are only found, they're a terrestrial turtle. They like sand prairies. They're only found in these sand prairies, and they don't move very fast or very far. They don't have high mobility. And so the populations that exist currently are very isolated. They're isolated because if they try to cross roads, they're much more likely to get killed by automobiles. If they try to cross agricultural fields, agricultural equipment might accidentally kill them. So these populations tend to become isolated, and likely their genetics also start to differentiate. Now, the impact that has on ornate box turtles specifically in the state, we don't really know because nobody has investigated it. But there are instances of these animals when they become genetically differentiated, and that leads to maybe a fixed trait that is deleterious or negative, then it becomes problematic, right? For example, maybe, you know, a population of turtles that's become isolated for some reason, that population's genes becomes sort of fixed in one kind of direction, and then a novel disease gets introduced to that population, and its genes just happen to not have the right configuration to, you know, code for the correct immune response to fend off that disease, and it wipes that population out, right? Now, that's a pure hypothetical, but that's the type of problem that can arise. Now, historically or prehistorically, there were examples of mammoths apparently that got isolated on islands that became smaller, right? So they changed in size from mainland because they were in a smaller environment, et cetera. So there are instances historically and over time of changes like that in species where populations have become isolated in certain locations.
Okay, so I have one more question for you, and you touched on conservation issues a few times. You talked a little bit about habitat fragmentation through roads, and also talked about the emerging infectious diseases. But I'm wondering if you can tell us what are some of the other conservation challenges to amphibians and reptiles. And I'm also thinking about, since so many of these species are relatively small, they don't have really big home ranges, maybe they would be more likely to be present on a lot of smaller homeowners' lands if they had the right habitat. And so I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about what are the conservation challenges, and then what can concerned citizens do either in their own backyard or through other means to help this group.
So the number one reason why species go extinct globally is loss, degradation, or fragmentation of habitat, right? There's, we talked about disease, and that is an important source of, or is an important conservation concern, but loss of habitat is, above and beyond the number one reason why species decline and go extinct. So it's a huge conservation concern. So protection of habitat is critical to the protection of organisms like amphibians and reptiles, but also everything else that would use that same habitat. I mean, if you protect prairie appropriately, you protect habitat for things like box turtles, perhaps, and the other amphibians, or I'm sorry, primarily reptiles. There might be some amphibians that live in those habitats, but there are many birds that need prairie habitat, right, et cetera, lots of rare plants. So protection of habitat is sort of, if we can, I like to think of it more as protection of biological communities, right? Not just, I want to protect box turtles, but I want to protect prairie, because I mean, I'm a wildlife biologist, and so I'm interested in all wildlife and the habitat that wildlife use. So that's protecting their plant communities, protecting all aspects of those wildlife communities. And when we do that, then obviously, when we start protecting habitat communities, then that acts as sort of an umbrella under which we can protect all of the things that live in those areas, right? So protection of habitat that exists is, preservation of that existing habitat is key, because it's really hard to get habitat back after it's gone, right? And, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, we're going to destroy this wetland, but we're going to build another one over there. Recreating a wetland is incredibly difficult to do. I mean, as scientists, we don't even understand exactly all of the different functions and processes that happen in wetland. So how are we going to recreate a wetland to mimic something we don't fully understand even? So preserving what exists is critically important, but it can also be possible to try and work towards restoring things that have been damaged to make them more sort of attractive to various species of wildlife. And, I read an article not that long ago. There was a study done. It was sort of a big meta-analysis study where they were looking at loss of prairie and how that affects, different habitat communities and the different species that live in those communities, et cetera. And they were talking about how even individual citizens, if people just planted native plants, right, dug up some of that mostly useless lawn grass and planted a garden, not of exotic ornamentals, but of native plants. Some native grasses, many of which are quite pretty, some native flowers, most of which are gorgeous. They're just not sold in nurseries for some reason as frequently, but you're doing the great benefit of promoting more native vegetation while also creating more host plants for insects that are important, native pollinators. There's lots of concern about honeybees. Honeybees are Eurasian, right? We have native pollinators here that, if we put native vegetation out, it promotes those native pollinators. And then we start creating little bits of habitat, especially if we connect those maybe to green spaces that are nearby our land or our property, for wildlife that can use them. And if everybody kind of tried to do that and make almost like little jumping points, native birds love that, for example, as well. So there are definitely ways that individuals can promote conservation, one of which is through little efforts such as this, but also volunteering with places like the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the Nature Conservancy, going out and learning as much as you can about these organisms and learning the things that they need and learning what aspects of their ecology are being affected by our activities. And so there's lots of ways that we can help. Even if, you don't have to be a conservation biologist with a PhD those aren't the only people that can help protect wildlife. If that was the case, those things would be in big trouble because there's not that many of us, right? And so we need the citizens that are interested to also be involved in this. It's absolutely critical. Some of the best preserves or land that is protected and managed for wildlife that I have been on have been owned by private landowners that just are really interested in native communities, native species, and they have taken it upon themselves to take this big parcel of land they had and restore it back to its sort of historical state, and do this huge service to all of the natural communities and species that exist that once existed in that area, simply because they felt it was the right thing to do and were interested. And those things have huge positive implications on our local flora and fauna.
Yeah, so, and you mentioned that, learning more about specific species will give folks ideas of what they can do, whether they have influence on a small or a large area. So your book is available in Wisconsin libraries, so people can go and check it out and access it that way. And it's also on Amazon and the University of Wisconsin Press. Just Google it and folks will find it. So again, the book is Amphibians and Reptiles of Wisconsin. And then if people have particular observations or if they want questions on identification, is there a certain place that you would direct people?
If they are observing rare species and would like to report those rare species observations, then the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources tracks those rare species observations, and that's a very important source of tracking those rare species. And it's called the Natural Heritage Inventory Database. And so if you look NHI up online, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, NHI, you can find where you'll be able to submit observations. There's an online form you can fill out to submit rare species observations. And if people have questions about identification, they're not sure about a species identity, or they have a question about it, they can email me if they're interested. It's my last name is Kapfer, K-A-P, F as in Frank, E-R, then J, all lowercase, at uww.edu. Now, I get a high volume of emails, so if I don't get back to you right away, obviously just bother me again, and I do the best I can, but I do answer a lot of emails about questions like that, which I'm happy to do. They can also contact officials at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources who are involved in the amphibians and reptiles. They will answer questions as well, if you have any. So there's a couple of different sources they can find to answer questions like that, or get help answering questions like that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your wisdom on this topic. Absolutely. I know I learned a lot today, and I'm sure that our viewers did too. So thank you to all of you that are out there watching today, the Western Wisconsin Journal, and we look forward to bringing you new content in the future.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye, Josh.